Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle, and this is my 55th video discussing British science fiction. In those 54 videos, I've shown hundreds of books and magazines from my own collection, giving a comprehensive survey of British science fiction publishing's first seminal 10 years after the First World War. And I've also given a detailed survey of the pre-war origins of the genre as well. So, having completed this survey, I had thought of ending these videos. However, a few respondents, Andrew Stevenson for one, have suggested that I might fill in a few more details of my own personal involvement. So, in these videos, in this new video, I'd like to return to subjects briefly touched upon in my very first video. At the age of 4, at the age of 4, I was admitted to hospital to have my tonsils removed. Then a standard practice for all preschool children in the UK. I was kept in for 2 days and found relief from the monotony by looking at some American newspaper comic sections lying around in my ward. I was captivated by a full-page newspaper insert of Superman. And although I couldn't read yet, I knew that this was something important that merited investigation. When I began school at the age of 5, I discovered the entire world of comic books from my classmates. The UK was awash with reprints of comics like Superman and Captain Marvel, the American superhero comics. And I immediately became an avid comic book reader. There were lots of comics featuring cowboys around, but I had no interest in those. I was entirely fixated on superheroes in their science fictional and fantasy adventures, though I had no knowledge of science fiction as a distinct genre. I simply recognised what I liked when I saw it. I was even moved to draw a story featuring my own comic strip hero, Atom Man, which mercifully has not survived. I do dimly remember that it was about a mad scientist who threatens the world with a weather control machine, and was almost certainly plagiarised from one of C.C. Beck's Captain Marvel stories, Battling Dr. Savannah. In my first video, I revealed how in May 1950, age 9, I became an avid reader of the new weekly comic Eagle, with its full-colour science fiction strip Dan Dare, brilliantly drawn by Frank Hampson. You see, another cover, Frank Hampson. Simultaneously, the Daily Mirror newspaper fantastic adventure strip Garth also entered a distinctly science fiction streak with a story called Journey to Jason. Garth's first fully fledged science fiction story in 1950. Journeying into space, as you can see. The only written manifestations I encountered of science fiction material were occasional serials in the boys' story papers published by D.C. Thomson, such as The Hotspur and its companion magazines Wizard and Adventure. Throughout the early 1950s, I continued to devour science fiction. But as I said, it was all comic strips. Then, in 1953, chanced to be listening to a BBC radio serialisation of H.G. Wells's The First Man in the Moon, which we see here in book form. The radio version was broadcast every Sunday afternoon, and it inspired me. Listening to it, I suddenly decided I would transcribe it into my own comic book, which I've kept. You see it here. First Man in the Moon, first comic book at the age of 11. It was done in tiny panels, which you can see here. There was 270 panels executed on 18 sides of an 8 by 10 inches drawing book. And I was encouraged to complete the strip by my father, who was himself a professional commercial artist. Now it's somewhat battered copy, but I hope you can follow it. It's disfigured by an unwise use of sellotape as well. Now, I was only 11 years old, as I've said, and I had very little knowledge of the world. In looking at it today, I can see that my crude drawings were very much inspired by Captain Marvel artist C.C. Beck. Now, he had a habit of drawing his men without a top lip. You can see there, there's no top lip. And on my male characters, I see now that I also drew them without a top lip. And when I had to draw a woman for the story, what we see here, and there was a woman character in the story, see there, I'm amused to see that I used my own red-headed mother as a template, complete with spectacles. Let's see there. Now, for the purposes of this video, bear with me. I've been comparing my comic strip version with the H.G. Wells book version, which I never saw until many years later. Now, page 1 of the comic, which we'll look at here, the opening scenes are remarkably similar to the book, wherein the narrator, Ronald Bedford, is leased a country cottage in order to write a play. But his writing is interrupted, as we see, if you can go along the panels there, is interrupted at the same time every evening by the perambulations of Cavor, who unconsciously makes a very loud and irritating buzzing noise. The two men quickly become acquainted, and when Bedford learns that Cavor is working on the development of cavorite, a new metal that is opaque to gravity, the opportunist Bedford insinuates himself as the business partner of the unworldly Cavor in order to exploit its commercial possibilities. Despite a long search online, I've been unable to discover who wrote the 1953 radio adaptation, the actual dates it was broadcast, or indeed anything at all about it. If any viewer has any information, please write to me, care of this channel. But my version clearly shows that it closely followed Wells's novel, including the explosion at Cavor's home when cavorite's being manufactured. See that there. Now, in due course, Cavor constructs a space vessel incorporating Cavorite shutters. See the shutters there. And the space vessel is thereafter referred to as the Sphere. In it, he intends to reach and explore the moon. However, my comic strip shows that the radio version then departed from the novel in introducing a third passenger on the moon trip, Adams, Cavor's assistant, which we see there. And he also introduced another new character, Cavor's young lady housekeeper, which we see coming in there. On learning of the intended moon voyage, she volunteers to accompany them. It could be very useful, don't you think? Only to be insultingly rebuffed by the sexist Bedford. No, I don't. This is a dangerous journey. We don't want any stupid women messing it up. However, there are close parallels to Wells's novel when they land on the moon and discover the speedy growth of plant life. We'll see the sequence at the bottom there. The lunar day and night each last for 14 days. So the plants have to grow extra quick to survive, if only for 14 days. Other Wellsian parallels follow when they discover the grazing huge moon calves, which we see there. Huge moon calves. And then both Wells and the radio script and my strip had the space travelers consuming a lunar fruit, which you can see at the bottom there. Continued at the top. And the effect of eating this fruit makes them violently drunk and aggressive when they encounter alien life forms. Now, after they themselves are overpowered by the Selenites and taken below the surface into the lunar underworld, the script followed Wells's idea of a manufactured artificial light. Which I depicted here. That's it. Artificial lights to illuminate the lunar underground. And then the boar could happen to cross what Wells called in chapter 5, what Wells called the Giddy Bridge, which you see there, the narrow bridge across an abyss, and they decide to make a break for it to try and escape. In Wells's chapter 17, the fight in the cave of the Moon Butchers, which we see there, where the moon calves are slaughtered for food, they discover that many tools and artifacts are made of gold, which the avaricious Bedford takes with him when they make their escape to the surface. They then separate to search for the sphere, which has been hidden by the fast-growing vegetation. And then Cavor is intrigued to encounter a Selenite who appears more intelligent than the moon calf herders. and he tries to communicate with them. After finding their ship, Bedford and Adams return for Cavor, only to find a note saying that he's been recaptured and taken back down below the surface. Adams wants to go after him, but Bedford argues to leave him behind because the night is imminent, which means certain death for anything remaining on the surface, as the air will freeze and disappear along with the vegetation. They fight, and pursued by the loyal Adams, Bedford scrambles back to the ship, clambers on board, puts his gold in the storage, and then he locks Adams out. He locks him out and takes off alone, as we see here. More by luck than judgment, he manages to get back to Earth. As we see at the top there. And he crashes into the sea off the coast of Cornwall. The radio strip closely follows the novel. He's helped to carry his gold by onlookers who he meets on the beach. He carries gold, and one of them invites him to come back to his hotel and tell me about your experience. But the man's thinking, I'd like to find out where he got his gold. Meanwhile, a curious small boy has clambered aboard the sphere and accidentally operated the controls. The sphere rushes into space and is lost along with the boy. Bedford then sees a bank manager and opens an account with a deposit of gold, about 700 weights of it. With the sphere lost, Bedford realises that no one will believe his story of the moon voyage, so he decides to change his name to Blake and settle down in obscurity to enjoy his fortune in gold. In a clever in-joke, we see on the bottom panels there, Bedford writes up his moon adventure as fiction, which he offers to the editor of the Strand magazine, where Wells's story was actually first published. But in accepting the manuscript, the editor tells him they'll have to change the names of his characters because of a newspaper headline, which we see there. 3 men die in explosion. Mr. Cavor, a not-so-clever scientist, with Arthur Adams and Ronald Bedford, a struggling author, were killed whilst experimenting. In Wells's novel, Bedford, now comfortably off, travels to Italy, and his story ostensibly ends. Then he receives a message from a man called Wenderjee, a radio experimenter, who'd read his story in the Strand. Wenderjee claims he's been receiving radio messages from the moon. Bedford visits Wenderjee and listens to several messages from Cavor that have been received on his powerful experimental radio apparatus. The ending of the radio serial and my strip were quite different. In the radio version, Cavor's housekeeper, Mabel Davenport, she's now identified as Mabel Davenport, has also read the Strand account and has tracked down Bedford. She accuses him of having murdered both Adams and Cavor. As Bedford is protesting his innocence, he receives a letter from Wenderjee, from a man called Wenderjee, informing him that he's been receiving radio messages from the moon. Bedford then apologises for his earlier behaviour and surprisingly as we see in this page sequence here, surprisingly asks Mabel to marry him, to which she responds, "How could I marry a liar? For all I know, you might be a killer. You might kill me, like you did. At least you probably did kill." Bedford then tells her, "We'll go to this chap Wendy, and perhaps you can hear, I think, Mr. Cavor on the moon, and then you'll know." Now, in the impressive closing chapters of Wells's book, Bedford, having decided to reveal the truth to the world, presents 6 long transcriptions of Cavor's radio messages which have been recorded. Chapter 18 sets out the full fascinating story as seen from Cavor's viewpoint. Cavor describes how the moon's mostly hollowed out with a vast central sea, and the civilization of the insecta of Selenites resembles a vast anthill, wherein the inhabitants are specially bred from birth to undertake the pursuits and the professions for which they're best suited. They're all very different physically, adapted to their roles from menial workers to elite intellectuals. The latter have hypertrophied giant brains, culminating in the Grand Lunar, the master of the moon. 2 of the intellectuals talk to Cavor, who act as his interpreters when he's finally summoned to the presence of the Grand Lunar, who questions him about life on Earth. This proves to be his undoing. As Wells tells the reader, his disastrous want of vulgar common sense had utterly betrayed him. He talked of war. He talked of all the strength and irrational violence of men, of their insatiable aggressions, the tireless futility of conflict. It filled the whole moon world with the impression of our race. And then I think it is plain that he made the most fatal admission upon himself. Alone hung the possibility, at least for a long time, of any further men reaching the moon. Belatedly, Cavor comes to realize his mistake, and when he tries to transmit the formula for Cavorite to Earth, his messages abruptly cease, with the clear implication that the Grand Lunar has ordered him to be killed to prevent mankind, with all its warlike lusts and aggression, on reaching the moon. Now, in my different radio strip version, Bedford and Mabel visit Wendy just in time to hear Cavor's last crackly message over his radio receiver. And now here we see my final page. "I've told him how powerful we are and how we fight in war. He doesn't seem to like war. He's leading me into..." No, Cavor breaks off with an agonizing dying scream. And I drew his skull being split open bloodily with a gold axe, from which we can infer that, alas, I must have been exposed to the American horror comics then flooding the UK. So ended my first venture into self-drawn comic strips, the first of dozens I would create over the next 8 years, beginning with my own versions of Dan Dare. Here's just a few of them. First, Dan Dare, which I wrote and drew, based on the Frank Hampson character. Each of 11. A few later ones, somewhat improved drawings, so we're older. Experience. yeah, get the idea. Final example. Semicolon, Miss Peabody. The story featured Uncle Ivor, the scientist. And there we go. So if anyone was interested in these, they could be the subject of my next video.